Welcome to the next unit of F360, Indiana Folklore and Folk Life. In this lecture, we continue our conversation about vernacular architecture and probe the historical trends of house styles. We'll also discuss the shortcomings of focusing on the structure of houses and the veneer of house styles when we want to understand the material culture of the state. As we noted in our first lecture, the study of historical buildings is limited by what has survived on the land and in the archival record. But also, it's limited by our preconceived notions of the past and our propensity to stereotype and generalize about groups of people, both today and in the past. In our last lecture, we studied a few of the types of folk houses in Indiana, paying close attention to the underlying structure: the single pin, double pin, shotgun, I houses. As I noted, there are other building types as well. We could talk about such building types as gable front houses, which, as the name describes, you enter on the gable end of the house. There's also a very common adaptation here in Indiana of the double pin and I house form by adding an L extension, often called a gabled L. However, these are yet more examples of house types. That is, considerations of the underlying structure of the house. Now I want to shift our attention to style, the aesthetic embellishments and treatments of a house. In high style or elite building, this often shapes the footprint of the house. However, in the folk style of houses we will discuss, this is often accomplished through changes in things such as trim and adornment to the housing types we've already discussed. The reason I want to consider style is that it provides an easy way to see the continuity and changes in cultural preferences over time. Just as most of us don't dress in the styles of the 1970s, people in the 1890s didn't build houses in the styles popular in the 1850s. However, it's not an exact science either. While some may have been attracted to the cutting-edge styles of the age, others wanted a house that worked and looked nice. And perhaps they decide to make theirs look a little bit like their more affluent neighbors. I'll be giving some dates as we go through and talk about these styles that I think are generally true for house designs. I'm not going to be focusing on the outliers. That means when I talk about Greek Revival style as seen in this image, we can give a date range of between 1840 and 1860. There were Greek Revival houses that were built before that and after that. I'm just trying to give you the era when they were in the most common use, so you can think about the styles and trends. Greek Revival is an easily recognized style of architecture that came into fashion during the heyday of Indiana settlement. While the southern river towns and early outposts of our state have examples of federal-style architecture, the Greek Revival style gained prominence and was adopted by many of the early settlers in the state, and it really became the first house style that was popular. Greek Revival is characterized by four primary design principles. First, bilateral symmetry. The houses always have the appearance of balance in them, evenness. If you divide the house in the middle, they almost mirror the other half. Second, the gable of the house is pronounced and an inferred pediment or Grecian-style frieze. So you see these little returns on the eave ends. They often have columns also. Each of these elements is present in the George Walcott House in LaGrange County, Indiana, built in 1837. While the Walcott House is a very early example of a Greek Revival house in Indiana, it's a surviving house of the elite, that 5% that we mentioned in our first lecture. It was invested with all the aesthetic features of the style, but when the same style of architecture gets applied to folk architecture, it gets simplified a little bit. Like the double pin building we looked at in our last lecture, the only remaining features is this harsh return on the eaves, which helped create that sense of a pediment. Here it is again in the brick double pin house from Campbellsburg, Indiana. When you see that triangular pediment on that gable end, those returning eaves, it's a Greek Revival house. Here's another vernacular reference to a Greek Revival style. Adorning the front gable type house in St. Joseph County, the Greek Revival is imagined through the returning eaves that we've mentioned, and also by adding columns, a folk form embellished with Greek Revival elements. Here's an I house in Adams County that's also a Greek revival. As you can see, elite styles influence the folk forms. The next style to come into prominence, that we'll talk about at least, is an Italianate style, which was popular from about 1855 to 1890. Here's an example we saw last lecture from New Carlisle, Indiana, built about 1860. Italianate style is typified by a low-pitched roof or a flat roof, rectangular-shaped building. It's very square-looking. Overhanging eaves with large brackets. Often there's a square cupola, that little tower piece right in the very top there. And there's an ornate porch. Here's the Guthrie House from Tunnelton that we looked at as well. It's also an Italianate. Note the brackets and the overhanging eaves and the cupola and the porch. All those same elements, just put together in a slightly different way. Here's a stripped-down version from Orleans, Indiana. But it's still that square form, and it has brackets and a cupola. In folk housing, such as an I house, you usually see the Italian style get reduced even more, and it uses just the brackets and perhaps the ornamental porch to create that Italianate style. In fact, the use of brackets would sometimes get married with earlier styles, such as a Greek revival as seen in this house from Ferdinand, Indiana. Note it has the returned eaves of a Greek revival house, but also the brackets and ornate porchwork of an Italianate. It's somewhere in between. The type is an I house, and the style, that exterior veneer, is both Greek and Italianate. I'll briefly talk about the next three high-style architectures and discuss the folk derivatives of it. First, Gothic Revival, which gained currency in the mid-1850s and continued through the 1870s. You can recognize it because there's a steep front-facing gable, delicate gable trim that's often made out of wood, and the windows are usually arched. All of this works to give an upward feel to the structure, which may be why it was a popular style for churches in the 19th century, such as the Poland Presbyterian Church in Clay County. The pointy windows and shutters combined with the steep roofline all point heavenward. For an I house, the structure is sometimes built with an additional gable to the front to invoke that Gothic style, and then the trim is added. This gable front house in Rising Sun near the Ohio River is a great example of a folk form with this high style. The steep frontward gable is identifiable, but the building also retains the bracket and porchwork common to the Italianate style. People mashed up these two styles to create a hybrid design to work on their vernacular style of building. The Second Empire style, which was in vogue from around 1860 to 1885, was employed by many affluent people across the state. It's identifiable by its hipped roof and domed or bracketed windows. While many towns have these buildings, I've been all over the state and I've seen them in many old neighborhoods, which for some reason are often thought to be the site of the local haunted house. I think that probably has to do with the fact that it mirrors the Addams Family house from TV. Anyway, it was not a popular folk style. It was not one that was readily adapted to the folk architecture that we've been talking about. But I will show you, here's a slightly more modest version of a bungalow in Aurora, Indiana. You can see it's somewhat stripped down. The final style of architecture for our class is the Queen Anne, a style popular from the 1880s through the 19-teens, maybe even a little later. While Queen Anne reigned from 1702 to 1714, long before Indiana became a state, we borrowed her name to refer to a revival of an English Baroque architectural look that developed during her time. In the late 19th century, in the U.S., Queen Anne's style was expressed through building a more asymmetrical house, with lots of gables and dormers, if you could swing it, a turret or a little tower if you like. It also had lots of gingerbreading, or more formally called fretwork trim, perhaps even fish scale style siding. As the style lingered, the trim became more toned down, and the tower or turret was lost. But still asymmetry and gables persisted. The fancy trim was adopted by many folk houses, But the problem of survival that we discussed in our first vernacular architecture lecture remains. This Queen Anne-style house from Hope is a gable L with a added tower and fancy fretwork. But it's fairly tame, at least compared to how it looked when it was first built in 1916. Maintaining the trim and finding the skilled labor required to replace it is expensive. And so many of the more humbler homes have lost their fancy trim. Well, there you have it, 5 important styles of the 19th century by which you can plot the aesthetic shifts in our state through the decades. Our conversation on house types taught us the grammar of folk architecture, the units that could be deployed to build a house. House types is what I'm talking about. Today's discussion of styles has increased our vocabulary of houses. This reflects vernacular architecture's linguistic roots. However, as anyone who's studied a language can attest, learning the grammar and form of a language is a far cry from being a poet. The shortcomings of this kind of structural and stylistic approach to researching the folk housing of Indiana is that it fails to account for the lived experiences, the people who were born, lived, and died in these structures, the furnishings within the structure. This is why folklorists depend upon ethnographic methods to collect and analyze not just the footprints and trappings of a house, but also the people who lived in them.